vigilant dawn descended through the thin atmosphere of the asteroid, where mining colony Theta 7 clung to survival. Its treated hull holding steady against the turbulence that would have shattered it just hours before. Una stood in the shuttle bay with 30 crew members assembled behind her, each one carrying supplies and equipment for the operation ahead. She had spent the 12-hour journey teaching them her techniques, showing hands that had never held a blade how to feel the grain of metal and apply stabilizing compounds with the right pressure and patience. Some of them learned faster than others, but all of them tried. The shuttle doors opened and they descended toward a colony that was literally crumbling around its inhabitants. Administrator Perth met them at the landing platform, his Veloci skin flickering with patterns of desperate hope. "You came," he said, his voice trembling. "We sent the distress signal expecting evacuation ships, not treatment teams. We did not have time to evacuate 3,000 people," Una replied. "So we are going to save the colony instead." Parth stared at her, taking in her small human frame and her bag of blade sharpening supplies. "How?" he asked. "By treating your metal the way my grandmother taught me to treat a damaged blade," Una said. "It sounds impossible, but I promise you it works." She divided her team into 6 groups and assigned each one to a different critical section of the colony. Atmospheric containment came first, then life support, then structural supports for the residential areas where families huddled together, waiting to learn whether they would live or die. Una took the hardest assignment for herself, the central hub where all the colony's critical systems converged. The infection there was worse than anything she had seen aboard the ship, with crystalline structures visible to the naked eye spreading across metal surfaces. Like frost on a winter window, she worked without rest, applying treatments, with hands that grew sore and then numb and then, moved by pure muscle memory, alone hours passed in a blur of metal and compound and the constant awareness that every second she spent on one section was a second she could not spend on another. Tikri found her during the 6th hour and pressed a container of water into her hands. "You must drink," the Martian said. "You cannot save anyone if you collapse." "I will rest when the atmospheric containment is stable," Una replied. But she drank the water anyway. The treatment was working, but it was not working fast enough. Reports came in from the other teams showing progress in some areas and setbacks in others. The colony's infrastructure had been degrading for months, and some sections were too far gone for stabilization to help. They had to prioritize, focusing on the systems that mattered most while accepting that they could not save everything. Near the end of the 8th hour, an alarm screamed through the colony's communication system. The atmospheric containment in the residential section was failing. The infection there, progressing faster than the team assigned to treat it, could work. 300 people lived in that section, including children who had done nothing wrong except be born in a place where ancient organisms had decided to feed on metal. Una made a decision without stopping to think. She grabbed the remaining stabilizing compounds from her supply bag and ran toward the failing section, ignoring Tikri's shout of protest behind her. The airlock to the residential section was cycling emergency warnings, counting down the minutes until the atmospheric seal failed completely. Una overrode the lock and stepped through into a corridor where the air was already thinning and the metal walls were visibly crumbling. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the section vented to vacuum. She worked faster than she had ever worked in her life, applying treatments by instinct rather than careful technique. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, teaching her that metal could feel fear and hope and relief just like any living thing. That a good metalworker learned to communicate with steel through touch alone. Una let her hand speak to the dying metal, telling it to hold together just a little longer, just long enough for the treatment to take effect. The walls groaned around her and her vision began to blur from oxygen deprivation. But she did not stop. She could not stop, not when children were counting on her to give them a chance to grow up. The section held barely, just as Yuna's legs gave out beneath her. She felt the stabilizing compounds take hold and the crystalline growth shudder. To a stop, hands grabbed her and dragged her toward the airlock as emergency. Teams rushed past to reinforce her work. She lost consciousness before they reached the medical bay. Yuna woke 3 days later in the Vigilant Dawn's medical facility with Tikri sitting beside her bed and Captain Serenity standing in the doorway. "The colony?" she asked, immediately saved, Tikri said. Her ears lifted high in the Russian expression of joy. "The atmospheric containment is stable and the critical systems are recovering. Though some structures were lost. And the organisms?" Yuna pressed, "Contained and dying," Captain Serenity replied, entering the room with her bioluminescence flickering in warm patterns. "Concord scientists have arrived to study the infection and develop detection methods based on your observations. And they are already working on official treatment protocols inspired by your techniques." She moved to stand beside Yuna's bed, looking down at her with an expression that transcended species. 3,000 people are alive because of what you did," the captain said. "The Concord has officially recognized your contribution and offered you a position in the engineering corps with full training and accelerated advancement." Yuna considered the offer for a moment, then shook her head slowly. "I'm honored," she said, "but I do not want to become an engineer." Captain Serene's patterns flickered with curiosity. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to establish a new specialty," Yuna replied. "One that combines traditional metalworking knowledge with modern ship maintenance. Because the Concord has thousands of engineers who understand diagnostics and sensors and computer systems. But they have forgotten that metal is more than data points on a screen." She looked at her hands, still bandaged from the work she had done. "Someone needs to remember the old ways," she continued. "Someone needs to teach future crews that their ancestors knew things about metal the machines cannot learn. And someone needs to keep sharpening the armor when the sensors say everything is fine." Captain Serenity was silent for a long moment, her bioluminescence shifting through patterns of consideration. "I will approve your request," she said finally. "You will establish the traditional metallurgy division aboard the Vigilant Dawn, and you will train others to continue your work throughout the fleet." 1 year later, Yuna sat in her workshop aboard the Vigilant Dawn, surrounded by ancient blade sharpening tools and modern engineering equipment arranged in perfect harmony. Her division had grown to include 12 specialists from 7 different species, all trained in techniques that their ancestors had developed long before any of them reached the stars. Tikri served as her second in command, her Russian ears always alert for vibrations that sensors might miss. The door opened and a young Kathrani engineering cadet stepped inside, nervous and uncertain. "I was told to report to the traditional metallurgy division," he said. "But I do not understand what blade sharpening has to do with starship maintenance." Yuna smiled and gestured for him to sit beside her workbench. "Let me show you," she said, pressing her palm against the metal surface and closing her eyes. "This ship is talking to us every moment of every day, telling us what it needs and where it hurts. But we have forgotten how to listen." She took the cadet's hand and placed it against the metal. "Your grandmother's grandmother knew how to hear steel sing," she said. "And now I'm going to teach you how to remember." The Vigilant Dawn hummed around them, its armor strong and its crew protected by knowledge that bridged the gap between ancient craft and future stars. And in her workshop, a human girl kept sharpening, kept teaching, kept remembering, because some things should never be forgotten. The command deck of the Vigilant Dawn fell silent as Yuna and Tikri were escorted before Captain Serenity. Their clothes still covered in metal dust and stabilizing compound, Captain Serendi stood at the center of the room. Her translucent veloci skin flickering with bioluminescent patterns that Yuna could not interpret. Chief Engineer Vorath stood beside the captain with his forearms clasped behind his back. His expression unreadable. Blade Technician Beak, the captain said, her voice carrying the harmonic resonance that made Veloci's speech both beautiful and unsettling. You broke confinement, entered restricted areas without authorization, and performed unauthorized modifications to ship systems. Yuna lifted her chin and met the captain's gaze. Yes, Captain, she said simply. Chief Engineer Vorath tells me that your unauthorized modifications may have saved the ship from catastrophic hull failure. Captain Serendi continued. He also tells me that he dismissed your initial reports and that his diagnostic systems failed to detect the threat you identified through direct observation. The captain's skin flickered with a complex pattern that made Vorath shift uncomfortably. I take full responsibility for that failure, Vorath said, his voice rough with admission. The blade technician's findings were correct, and I should have investigated more thoroughly before dismissing her concerns. The question before me now, the captain said, is what to do with a crew member who broke regulations to save lives that would have been lost if she had followed orders. Before Yuna could respond, an urgent communication alert interrupted the proceedings. The face of a frightened Veloci appeared on the main display screen, his bioluminescent patterns flashing in chaotic distress. This is Administrator Purith of Mayan Colony Theta 7, he said. Our situation has become critical, and we require immediate assistance. What is your status, Administrator? Captain Serendi asked. Our atmospheric containment systems are failing, Purith replied. The metal structures throughout the colony have become brittle and are crumbling without explanation, and our engineers cannot determine the cause or find a solution. Yuna stepped forward without thinking. Administrator, has your colony recently received supplies or equipment from salvaged vessels? She asked. Purith's patterns flickered with surprise at being addressed by a junior human crew member. Yes, he said slowly. 6 months ago, we purchased mining equipment from a salvage operation that recovered it from an ancient derelict. The same source as our contamination, Tikri said quietly. Captain Serendi turned to face Yuna directly. You believe the colony is infected with the same organisms attacking our ship? She asked. I am certain of it, Yuna replied. The symptoms are identical, and the timeline fits perfectly with the progression rate we have observed. Can your treatment be applied to their structures? The captain asked. Yuna hesitated, calculating the scale of the problem in her mind. In theory, yes, she said. But treating an entire colony would require far more supplies than we have aboard, and we would need to reach them before their atmospheric containment fails completely. How long do they have? Vorath asked. Based on the progression rate, Yuna said. Perhaps 72 hours before the critical systems fail. The weight of that number hung in the air as everyone on the command deck understood what it meant. 3,000 people would die in 3 days unless something was done. We cannot land, Vorath said grimly. Our own hull is still compromised, and if the organisms spread further during the descent, we could break apart. Then we treat our hull first, Yuna said, her mind racing through possibilities. Accelerate the treatment of our remaining infected sections. Manufacture additional stabilizing compounds using our onboard resources, and then descend to the colony. That plan requires us to remain in the asteroid field for at least another 12 hours. Lieutenant Cho said from his station. Every hour increases our risk of additional impacts, and every hour we delay increases the risk to the colony. Yuna countered. You are asking us to risk 400 lives to save 3,000, Cho said. That is not a decision for a blade technician to make. Captain Serendi raised a hand for silence. her skin flickering with patterns of deep contemplation. "Blade Technician Beak," she said. "You have demonstrated knowledge and skills that none of my senior officers possess, so I am asking you directly. Do you believe your treatment method will work on the scale required to save both this ship and that colony?" Yuna felt the weight of the question pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to say yes with absolute confidence, but she could not lie to the captain or herself. "I believe it will work," she said carefully. "The principles are sound and the results aboard this ship have been consistent. But I cannot guarantee success because no one has ever attempted something like this before." "Can you guarantee failure if we do nothing?" the captain asked. "Yes," Yuna said without hesitation. "Without treatment, the organisms will continue to spread until the metal structures become too brittle to maintain integrity, and both the ship and the colony will fail." "Captain," Serene's patterns shifted to a configuration that Yuna had never seen before. Something that looked like decision crystallizing into action. "Then we proceed," the captain announced. "Chief Engineer Varth, you will coordinate with Blade Technician Beak to complete treatment of our hull and manufacture additional supplies for the colony." "Captain," Lieutenant Cho protested. "With respect, we should request a proper rescue mission from Concord Command rather than risking our ship on an untested treatment developed by a junior maintenance worker. A proper rescue mission would take 2 weeks to organize." Captain Serenity replied, "The colony has 3 days, so we will not abandon them to wait for help that cannot arrive in time." She turned to face the entire command deck, her bioluminescence blazing with quiet authority. "This crew includes 400 individuals from a dozen different species," she said. "We were brought together because the Galactic Concord believed we could accomplish more through cooperation than any single species could achieve alone. And today, we will prove them right." Her gaze settled on Yuna. Blade Technician Beak saw what our sensors could not detect. She continued. She persisted when her superiors dismissed her concerns, and she acted when action was needed. So when we reach that colony and save those people, every member of this crew will remember that it happened because one human refused to accept that she could not make a difference. Yuna felt her throat tighten with emotion. She could not express, "I will need help," she said. "More hands than just Tikri and myself." "What kind of help?" Vorath asked. "Anyone who has ever worked with metal," Yuna replied. "Blade technicians, metalworkers, maintenance crews, even crew members who know nothing about engineering but are willing to learn. Because treating an entire colony will require everyone we can train." Vorath turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she had come aboard the Vigilant Dawn, he looked at her not as an inferior but as an equal. "Then let us begin," he said. "We have 12 hours to finish treating this ship and prepare for the largest metal stabilization operation in Concord history." Yuna nodded and gathered her supplies. She had spent months being ignored and dismissed, told that her skills were insignificant and her concerns were not worth hearing. Now she was about to lead a team that would determine whether 3,000 people lived or died. No pressure at all. Yuna sat on the edge of her bunk with her hands pressed together and her eyes fixed on the sealed door of her quarters, counting the seconds until she made a decision that would end her career and possibly her freedom. 48 hours of confinement meant 48 hours of the crystalline organisms spreading through the hull, 48 hours of the ship traveling deeper into an asteroid field that could shatter weakened metal like glass. She could not wait. The door lock was electronic, designed to keep junior crew members inside during disciplinary confinement. But Yuna had spent months maintaining bladed tools throughout the ship, and she knew things about the Vigilant Dawn that the engineers had never thought to ask. She retrieved a small maintenance kit from beneath her bunk and removed a thin metal probe, designed for adjusting the tension on ceremonial sword hilts. The door panel came off with 4 quick movements, revealing the simple circuitry behind the lock. 3 minutes later, she stepped into the corridor and began moving toward the section of hull where the spiral pattern of infection originated. If she could not convince anyone to stop the ship, she would have to stop the infection herself. Yuna had no engineering training and no authority to modify ship systems. But she understood metal in ways that went deeper than diagnostics and sensor readings. Her grandmother had taught her that every piece of steel had a personality, a grain and a temper that could be worked with or against. The organisms in the hull were changing the metal's nature, converting strong alloy into brittle crystal. But Yuna knew techniques for stabilizing damaged metal that her grandmother had learned from her grandmother before her. She gathered her blade sharpening supplies from the maintenance workshop, filling a bag with polishing compounds and stabilizing oils and tools that humans have used to care for metal since before they learned to write. Then she made her way to the water reclamation section where the infection had begun. The hull plating there felt wrong beneath her palms, the vibration deeper and more unsettling than anywhere else on the ship. Yuna knelt before the wall and began to work. She applied stabilizing compounds to the metal surface, working them into the microscopic cracks the way she would treat a blade that had begun to develop stress fractures. The techniques were not designed for starship armor, but the principles were the same, penetrating the metal with substances that would bond with the crystalline structures and prevent further growth. She worked for hours, moving from section to section along the spiral pattern, treating each area of infected metal with careful attention. The work was exhausting, and her shoulders ached from the constant pressure she applied. But she did not stop. Somewhere in the middle of the 3rd hour, she heard footsteps approaching and turned to find Tikri standing behind her with wide eyes and trembling hands. "What are you doing?" The Narration whispered. "You broke confinement, and now you are applying blade polish to the hull plating." "I am not polishing it," Yuna said without stopping her work. "I am treating the infection with compounds that stabilize metal and prevent crystalline growth." "That cannot possibly work," Tikri protested. "Look at the sections I have already treated," Yuna replied, gesturing toward the wall behind her. "Compare them to the untreated sections and tell me what you see." Tikri moved along the corridor, running her sensitive fingers over the treated and untreated metal. Her ears lifted slowly in the Narration expression of astonishment. "The fractures have stopped spreading," she said. "The crystalline growth has halted in every section you have treated." "Old knowledge," Yuna explained. "My ancestors learned to stabilize metal long before they understood the science of why it worked. And the organisms eating this ship do not care whether my techniques are officially approved." Tikri stood frozen for a moment, caught between her training that told her this was impossible and the evidence of her own senses that told her it was working. Then she knelt beside Yuna and took a handful of treatment compounds from the bag. "Show me what to do," she said. They worked together through the night, Yuna teaching Tikri the ancient techniques, while Tikri used her engineering access to reach sections of hull that Yuna could not have entered alone. The spiral pattern of infection was large, stretching across nearly a quarter of the ship's interior. But they made progress one section at a time near dawn. They reached the outer edge of the infection, where the organisms had spread farthest from their origin point. Yuna traced the contamination backward through her mental map and finally understood how it had begun. 3 months ago, she said. The ship took on emergency supplies from a damaged freighter that we found drifting near the fringe border. Tikri's ears flattened. "I remember that incident," she said. "The freighter's crew had died from unknown causes, and the cargo was quarantined for biological hazards before being distributed. But no one checked the freighter's hull for contamination," Yuna concluded. "The organisms must have transferred when our cargo bay connected to theirs, And that freighter was salvaging equipment from an ancient derelict when it became disabled, Tikri added. The organisms could have been dormant for centuries before finding fresh metal to consume, before they could discuss further. The ship shuddered violently, and an alarm screamed through the corridors. An asteroid had struck the port side of the Vigilant Dawn. Yuna felt the impact through the deck plates, felt the vibration of stressed metal and the terrifying sensation of structure pushed beyond its limits, but the hull held barely alarms. Continued to sound as damage reports flooded the ship's communication system. Internal sensors were finally detecting structural weaknesses in sections of hull that had not been treated, sections where the crystalline infection had progressed too far for the compromised metal to hide. Captain Serene's voice emerged from the speakers. Calm but urgent. All hands to damaged stations, she announced. Engineering teams report to affected sections immediately. Yuna and Tikri looked at each other, both covered in metal shavings and stabilizing compound, both knowing that their secret work was about to be discovered. Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Chief Engineer Vareth appeared with a team of repair technicians. Behind him, he stopped dead when he saw the two of them kneeling before a section of treated hull plating, surrounded by blade sharpening supplies and looking like nothing an engineer had ever seen before. "What is this?" he demanded, his four eyes narrowing with confusion and anger. "We found the source of the hull weakness," Tikri said quickly. "Microscopic organisms infecting the metal and converting it to crystal. And Yuna developed a treatment that stops the growth. Blade sharpening compounds?" Varath said incredulously. "You treated Starship armor with blade sharpening compounds?" "Yes," Yuna said, rising to her feet and meeting his gaze without flinching. "And it worked, so you can arrest me later. But right now you need to compare the treated sections to the untreated sections and decide whether you want to save this ship or punish me for being right." The ship shuddered again as another asteroid fragment struck the weakened port side. Varath turned to his team. "Run structural comparisons," he ordered. "Treated sections versus untreated. Full metallurgical analysis. And I want results in 5 minutes." The analysis took 3 minutes when Varath reviewed the data. His forearms slowly uncrossed and his expression shifted from anger to something Yuna had never expected to see. It looked almost like respect. "The treatment is working," he admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of being wrong. "The crystalline growth has stopped completely in every section she touched." He turned to face Yuna directly. "How much of the ship have you treated?" he asked. "Perhaps a third of the infected area," she replied. "We ran out of time." Varath looked at the damage reports, still scrolling across his datapad. At the alerts warning of structural failures spreading through sections that Yuna had not reached. "Then we have work to do," he said. "Show my teams your technique, blade technician, and pray that your old knowledge can save us from the disaster my new sensors failed to prevent." Yuna grabbed her bag of supplies and began to teach, hoping that 400 lives could be saved by the wisdom of ancestors who had never imagined their descendants would need to sharpen the armor of a starship. Yuna Beak pressed her palm against the cold metal wall and closed her eyes, feeling the vibration that no one else seemed to notice. A low hum that traveled through the deck plates and into her bones like a warning whisper from the ship itself. She was not supposed to be in the engineering section at this hour. But sleep had abandoned her 2 nights ago when the strange vibration first appeared. And now she wandered the corridors of the Vigilant Dawn like a ghost, searching for answers. The ship served the Galactic Concord, a fragile alliance of 12 spacefaring civilizations that had agreed to stop fighting each other long enough to patrol the contested fringe territories together. And its crew of 400 represented a dozen different species working in uneasy cooperation. Yuna represented humanity in the lowest possible capacity, assigned to the maintenance course as a blade technician. which meant she spent her days sharpening ceremonial blades, combat knives, and cutting tools for crew members who barely acknowledged her existence. Her grandmother had taught her the art of blade work back on Earth, showing her how to read metal the way others read books, how to feel the stress and strain in a piece of steel, how to coax an edge into perfect sharpness through patience and understanding. Those skills had earned her a position aboard a starship, but not the respect that came with more important roles. She moved her hand along the wall, following the vibration to its source, and found herself standing before a section of interior hull plating that looked perfectly normal to the naked eye. But when she pressed both palms against it and truly listened with her hands, she felt something wrong. Microfractures spreading through the metal like cracks in thin ice. Yuna pulled a small tool from her pocket, a metal stress tester she used when examining damaged blades, and ran it across the surface of the plating. The readings confirmed what her hands already knew. The metal was failing from within, developing tiny fractures that would grow larger over time until the entire section became brittle and weak. She documented her findings on her personal datapad and made her way to the main engineering bay, where Chief Engineer Vorath supervised the night shift with all four of his arms folded across his broad chest. Vorath belonged to the Kethrani species, tall beings with blue-gray skin and 40 years of fleet maintenance experience that he never let anyone forget. Chief Engineer, Yuna said, keeping her voice respectful even as her heart pounded with urgency. I need to report a structural concern regarding the hull plating in Section 7. Vorath turned two of his four eyes toward her while the other two remained fixed on his console, a gesture that communicated exactly how little interest he had in whatever she might say. You are the blade sharpener, he said, his voice carrying the rumbling undertone common to his species. Why are you in the engineering bay during third shift? And why do you believe you have found something my diagnostic systems have missed? Yuna held out her datapad, showing him the readings from her stress tester. I felt vibrations coming from that section, she explained. When I examined the plating, I found evidence of microfractures forming in patterns that suggest internal degradation rather than external damage. Vorath took the datapad with one hand, while using another to pull up the official diagnostic reports on his console. The ship's sensors detect no structural anomalies in Section 7 or any other section, he said, handing back her device. Your equipment is designed for small blades, not starship armor, and your training does not qualify you to interpret hull integrity data. But the fractures are there, Yuna insisted. I can feel them, and my tester confirms what I felt. Feelings are not engineering data, Vorath replied, his tone hardening. Return to your quarters and your knives, blade technician, and do not waste my time with concerns you are not qualified to raise. Yuna wanted to argue, but she recognized the dismissal in his posture, the way all four arms had uncrossed and his body had turned back toward his console. She left the engineering bay with frustration burning in her chest. But she did not return to her quarters. Instead, she spent the remaining hours of the night cycle visiting every section of hull she could access, pressing her palms against metal and listening for the warning whispers that the ship's sensors could not hear by morning. She had found the same microfractures in 3 more sections, all forming patterns that radiated outward from somewhere near the ship's water reclamation system. She needed to report this to someone who would listen, someone with the authority to order a proper investigation. Captain Serendi commanded the Vigilant Dawn with the calm wisdom that characterized her species. The Veloci, beings who communicated through patterns of bioluminescent light that flickered across their translucent skin. If anyone would take a junior crew member's concerns seriously, it would be the captain. Yuna made her way to the command deck and requested an audience with Captain Serendi through the proper channels. But before she could reach the captain's office, a hand closed around her arm. Lieutenant David Cho stood beside her, A human officer in his 30s, with the tired eyes of someone who had spent too many years watching his species struggle for respect among the stars. "Blade Technician Beak," he said quietly, steering her away from the captain's office. "I heard you caused trouble in engineering last night." I reported a legitimate concern. Yuna replied, pulling her arm free. "The hull plating is developing fractures that the sensors cannot detect." Cho sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Humans already have a poor reputation in the Concord, and every time one of us steps out of line, it makes things harder for all the others." "This is not about stepping out of line," Yuna protested. "This is about ship safety. It is about knowing your place," Cho countered. "You sharpen knives, and that is all." So, when a Kathrani chief engineer with 40 years of experience tells you that you are wrong, you accept that you are wrong and move on. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "If you go to the captain with this, you will embarrass yourself, embarrass humanity, and probably end up confined to quarters for insubordination. So drop this matter before you ruin your career and make enemies you cannot afford to have." Yuna stared at him, seeing in his eyes the accumulated weight of years spent keeping his head down and his mouth shut in order to survive in a galaxy that saw humans as newcomers barely worth tolerating. She understood why he had become this way, but she could not accept it. "There are 400 people on this ship," she said softly. "If I am right and I say nothing, they could all die." Cho shook his head slowly. "And if you are wrong, which you almost certainly are, you will have thrown away everything for nothing." He walked away without looking back, leaving Yuna standing alone in the corridor with a choice to make. She looked toward the captain's office, then down at her hands, the hands that had felt the truth hiding in the metal. The ship's sensors might not believe her, and the chief engineer might not believe her, and her own people might want her to stay silent. But she knew what she had felt. The Vigilant Dawn was sick, and if she did not find a way to prove it, everyone aboard would pay the price for her failure to act. Yuna turned away from the captain's office, but not to give up if no one would listen to her words. She would have to find evidence that no one could ignore. The fractures in the metal were spreading, and somewhere in their pattern lay the answer to what was killing the ship from within. She just had to find it before time ran out. 3 days passed while Yuna mapped the invisible disease spreading through the ship's armor, stealing hours from her sleep and minutes from her meals to visit every section of hull she could reach. Without triggering security alerts, she worked in secret, pressing her palms against metal walls and feeling for the telltale vibrations of fractures forming beneath the surface, recording her findings on a personal datapad that grew heavier with evidence each passing night. Pattern that emerged from her mapping sent a chill down her spine. The microfractures were not random damage or natural wear, but instead radiated outward in a perfect spiral from a central point near the water reclamation system, growing larger and more numerous as they spread toward the outer hull. Yuna had seen patterns like this before, in the crystalline growth structures that formed on certain alien ceremonial blades when they were improperly stored. Those blades came from the Narration homeworld, where a particular type of metal-eating fungus could embed itself in steel and slowly convert it into brittle crystal over months or years. Could something similar be happening to the ship? She needed samples to confirm her theory, but taking samples from the hull plating without authorization would get her thrown in the brig. Yuna spent a full day considering her options before deciding to seek help from someone who might understand what she had found. Tikri worked in the lower engineering section, handling minor repair tasks that the senior engineers considered beneath their attention. Her species, the Mreshans, resembled upright salamanders with smooth purple skin and large ears that could hear frequencies far beyond human range. Yuna found her during a meal break in the crew mess hall, sitting alone at a corner table with a bowl of nutrient gel that her species preferred over solid food. "May I join you?" Yuna asked, sliding into the seat across from Tikri without waiting for an answer. Tikri's large eyes blinked slowly in the Narration gesture of mild surprise. "You are the human blade sharpener," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality common to her people. "Why would you wish to sit with a junior repair technician?" "Because I need your help," Yuna replied honestly. "And because I think you might be the only person on this ship who will listen to what I have found." She pulled out her datapad and showed Tikri the map she had created, explaining the pattern of fractures and her theory about crystalline growth organisms. Tikri studied the data with growing interest, her large ears twitching as she processed the information. "This pattern does resemble fungal crystallization," she admitted. "But how could such organisms infect a starship hull made of reinforced alloy?" "I do not know yet," Yuna said, "but I need to examine samples from recent hull repairs to confirm whether organisms are present. And I cannot access those samples without help from someone in engineering." Tikri was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the datapad as she considered the risks of what Yuna was asking. "If I help you and we are caught," she said finally, "my career in the Concord fleet will end before it truly begins. And if you do not help me, and I am right," Yuna countered, "there may not be a fleet to have a career in." The Narration made a soft clicking sound that indicated reluctant agreement. "Meet me in Repair Bay 7 during third shift," she said. "I will bring samples from the last 3 hull patches we installed." That night, Yuna waited in the dimly lit repair bay until Tikri arrived carrying a sealed container of metal fragments. They worked together in silence, using Yuna's blade testing equipment to examine each sample under magnification. What they found made Tikri's purple skin turn pale. Embedded within the metal were microscopic organisms, so small they would be invisible to standard diagnostic scans, slowly converting the alloy into a crystalline structure that would eventually become brittle and shatter. "The diagnostics look for cracks and stress fractures," Tikri whispered. "Not living things too small to see. That is why the sensors found nothing," Yuna agreed. "The ship's systems are not programmed to detect biological contamination in metal before they could discuss their next move." An alarm blared through the corridors, and Captain Serene's voice emerged from the communication system. "All hands to stations," the captain announced. "We have received a distress signal from mining colony Theta 7 and are changing course to investigate." Tikri's ears flattened against her head in the Narration expression of fear. "Mining colony Theta 7 is located in the Kartos asteroid field," she said. "Navigation through that region requires precise maneuvering through debris clouds." Yuna felt her stomach drop. "If the hull integrity is compromised," she said slowly, "even minor impacts with asteroid fragments could shatter the weakened sections." They stared at each other, both understanding the terrible danger that awaited the unsuspecting crew. "We must report this now," Tikri said urgently. "The captain must know before we enter the asteroid field." Yuna nodded and gathered her evidence, all of it. The maps and the samples and the readings that proved beyond any doubt that the Vigilant Dawn was dying from within. She filed a formal report through the proper channels, attaching every piece of data she had collected, and requested an immediate audience with Captain Serene to discuss a critical threat to ship safety. The response came 2 hours later, but it did not come from the Captain Chief Engineer. Varath summoned her to the main engineering bay, where he stood waiting with his forearms crossed and his expression carved from stone. "I have reviewed your report," he said, his voice cold and hard, "and I have run additional diagnostics based on your claimed findings." "And what did you find?" Yuna asked, though she already knew the answer from the anger in his eyes. "I found nothing," Varath replied. "Because there is nothing to find, and I have tolerated your interference in engineering matters long enough." He stepped closer, towering over her small human frame. "You are hereby formally reprimanded for submitting false reports, wasting fleet resources, and continuing to pursue concerns you were ordered to abandon," he declared. "You are confined to quarters for 48 hours effective immediately." "Please," Una said, her voice steady despite the despair rising in her chest. "At least delay our entry into the asteroid field until a proper biological scan can be conducted." "There will be no delay," Vorath said. "There are people in danger at that colony, and I will not tell the captain to abandon them because a blade sharpener has convinced herself that she knows more than Concord engineering systems." 2 security officers escorted Una to her quarters and sealed the door behind her. She stood alone in the small room, feeling the subtle vibration of the ship's engines as it accelerated toward the asteroid field and the colony that waited somewhere within that deadly maze of rocks through her feet. She felt something else, the faint tremor of fractures spreading through weakened metal, growing larger with each passing hour. 48 hours of confinement stretched before her like a death sentence, not for her, but for everyone aboard the ship who trusted the sensors and the engineers and the systems that could not see what was killing them. Her datapad sat on her desk, useless now that she had no way to act on the information it contained. Then she noticed a message notification blinking in the corner of the screen. It was from Tikri, and it contained only 2 words and a set of numbers, "Distress signal details," the message said, followed by the transmission frequency of the mining colonies. Original call for help. Una accessed the recording and listened to the panicked voice of a colony administrator describing their crisis. "Our equipment is failing," the voice said. "Metal structures are becoming brittle and crumbling without explanation, and we cannot determine the cause." The color drained from Una's face as she understood. The mining colony was infected with the same organisms that were killing the Vigilant Dawn, and no one aboard the ship had made the connection. They were flying into an asteroid field with a compromised hull to save a colony that was dying from the same disease, and Una was locked in her quarters, helpless to do anything but wait and pray that someone would listen before it was too late.